Hello, everybody, and welcome to what was meant to be an in-person lecture, but because we have no power, has turned into an asynchronous online lecture. This is the second lecture in the series on virtual reality, and in particular, the reality of virtual reality. So how today is going to go, I'm going to just recap some of the points that I had in the announcement. So what I'd like you to do is just review this lecture. And because it's online and asynchronous, you can obviously go back, you can slow it down, you can rewind, you can do whatever you like. And I want you to just note areas of concern, so areas that you don't understand. And then I would also like you to write down any questions you have. Then tomorrow, hopefully we will be in person, and then I can review those questions before we move on to the final part of our section on virtual reality, which is concerned less with whether virtual reality is real and more with whether it is valuable. But before we get anywhere near there, we need to quickly recap what or how we define virtual reality. So we are working with Chalmers's paper, David Chalmers, The Virtual and the Real. And he offers a definition of virtual reality proper, which a good idea to pay attention to for your exam. And he defines it using a threefold criteria. The first is that it is immersive. The second is that it is interactive. And the third is that it is computer generated. And if you have those three features, you have what he calls virtual reality proper. Why the proper? Because we want to distinguish it from things that are, say, for example, interactive and computer generated, but not immersive. So an example of that would be something like Pokemon Go. Or, for example, you might have something that is immersive but not interactive. So if I'm watching a movie through a virtual reality headset, it's not interactive. And the reason it's not interactive is because I cannot affect the environment. And what we did last week was we went through each of these. So I'm just going to quickly recap them. So immersion, as the sort of word suggests, it's kind of being in the environment, being present. And we don't have it on the slide, but the word that we spoke about a lot last week was having a perspective in the environment. So literally being located somewhere in the environment. It's as opposed to, say, for example, having like a bird's eye view or a quote unquote third person perspective on the environment. If you are immersed in it, you are in it, you are located in it, which is normally, it's similar to having a perspective. So last week I used the example of being in the lecture hall, like actually being present somewhere in the lecture hall, as opposed to looking at a map of the lecture hall. On the map side of things, I am not located, I am not immersed in the lecture hall, whereas if I'm present in the lecture hall, then I am. I have a perspective on it. The second thing was interaction, and that was the ability to affect the environment. And we mentioned last week that it's very important that users can affect the environment as opposed to just the environment affecting users. So as an example of a non-interactive virtual world, we gave, or say a virtual environment, instead of a virtual world. I gave the example just now of watching a movie through a virtual reality headset. So that would be immersive and would be computer generated, but it would not be interactive. And the reason is because while the movie can affect me, can make me happy, sad, or whatever the case is, it's not the case that I can affect the movie. The plot just continues as it would always have done. And then the final thing is that these realities, these virtual realities, these immersive and interactive worlds also have to be computer generated. And the idea is that if we have all three of those in place, we've got virtual reality. We're happy. Okay, so that is virtual reality proper. And so last week, we basically ended at this point, which was the core question and the kind of sub-questions within that of whether or not virtual reality is real. And we sort of canvassed a few questions or like the kind of some of your intuitions. And most of you, it seems, were virtual reality irrealists. So if you are a virtual reality irrealist, this is the package of views that you would likely be committed to, or some combination of these. The idea would be, for example, if I'm using a virtual reality headset and I encounter a table, then that's a virtual object, but doesn't really exist. It doesn't have existence. It's more of an illusion or a fiction, and we'll get into the difference between those two things in a bit. But the most important takeaway doesn't exist. So the same thing for virtual events. So for example, let's say that I am in an interactive video game. So a video game that I play using a virtual reality headset. The events that unfold in that video game, they don't really exist. They don't happen in a real sense of happening. Third thing is that experiences are illusory. And we saw that a kind of broad definition of an illusion, or at least a necessary feature of an illusion, is that it's non-veridical. So it doesn't track truth. It's not a true perception in this case. And the suggestion there is that whatever experiences we have, if I experience myself in virtual reality, as say I'm playing a video game that's based in World War II, and if I experience myself as being in 1940s Germany, that's an illusion. I am not actually in 1940s Germany. And then the final thing is that virtual experiences are less valuable. And I think you could actually be a virtual realist and still hold that fourth view that virtual experiences are less valuable. But for now, let's just keep it on the irrealist side of things, because we will also look at the question either tomorrow or on Wednesday of how the reality or lack thereof of virtual reality makes those experiences more or less valuable. In other words, where does the value come from if virtual reality is valuable? And does it come from the fact that those experiences are real, or does it come from the fact that they're not? But for now, like I said, we're just going to treat it on the side of the irrealist. The irrealist thinks that they are less valuable than real life, non-virtual experiences. So that's the virtual irrealist. On the flip side, you have virtual realism. And this is Chalmers's position. And basically what we're doing there is we're taking all the knots in virtual irrealism and we're getting rid of them. So rather than virtual objects not existing, they do. Rather than events in reality not taking place, they actually really do take place. Experiences, in the same way, are non-illusory. When I experience myself as being in 1940s Germany, or maybe let's say, for example, I'm using that game Second Life. Remember that virtual reality game that I mentioned last week, where you have an avatar and you interact with other avatars in that online world they call the grid? So the idea is that when I go for coffee with another avatar in Second Life, and we are interacting and having our coffee, that experience is real. We are actually, in an important sense of the word actual, we are actually having coffee. And that experience is non-illusory as a whole. And then finally, like I said, we'll probably talk about this more tomorrow and Wednesday, but with the virtual realist often comes the idea that virtual experiences can be as valuable as non-virtual experiences. And one way we would argue that they're valuable is by saying they're real. Like, why shouldn't they have value if they are as real as non-virtual experiences? So that's the suggestion. So I've said already that Chalmers is a virtual realist. We're now going to get into the details of just how he is a virtual realist. So one of the quintessential examples of virtual reality, which I think most of you knew about, thankfully, in our lecture last week, was The Matrix, the film. And here we have Neo, and him and his colleague are sitting at a table, and the question, we can now frame this in terms of those 4 criteria that we saw on the last slide. So is the table a real digital object? Is the event of they're looking at each other and talking actually taking place? Is that experience as valuable as it would be in quote unquote real life? All of those things. And here's what Chalmers has to say. So he wrote a paper called The Matrix of Metaphysics. And this, we can think of the virtual and the real as kind of extending on that paper. So anyways, in this extract, he references back to the Matrix as metaphysics. And what he says is that in that paper, I argued that if we are in a matrix, most of our ordinary beliefs, e.g. that there are tables, are true. If we discovered that we are in a matrix, instead of saying that there are no tables, we should say instead that tables are digital or computational objects made of bits. And we could almost sub in like an actual there or a real. So We should say that tables are real objects, digital or computational objects, or they are actual objects, digital or computational. So it's one of the ways that Chalmers kind of gets a handle on this question, which will be the way that I suggest we get a handle on this question of whether or not virtual reality is real or if it's not real, is through the question of the truth of our beliefs about it. So basically what Chalmers is attacking here, or what he's trying to kind of target, is the quite common sense idea that say we're in the matrix, we're kind of moving through the matrix, but we don't know that we're in the matrix. And we identify a table, we bang into a table, and we form the belief this is a table. Now, most of us kind of pre-reflexively would say that if we then discovered that we were in the matrix, we would think that belief is now false because it's not a real table. It was a matrix table. It was an illusion generated by or as part of the matrix. So Chalmers is going for that idea, the idea that the beliefs and the beliefs about and the perceptions of the virtual realities that we move through, he's targeting the idea that those are false. And instead, what he's trying to say is that no, instead of saying when I bump into a table, that instead of saying that there is no table there is actually, or in real life, no table, what I should say instead is that there is a digital table or a virtual table. So that's the subtle difference that Chalmers is trying to get us to move towards. It is not the case that there is no table, right? Rather, there is a table, but it's not a real table, it's a virtual table. So on the one hand, yes, the belief that there is just a table is false. But the belief, or that there's just a real table, let's say that. So the belief that there is a real table is false. But that doesn't mean that any belief we could form of virtual reality is false. Rather, we can form true beliefs so long as the belief is that the table is there, but it's a virtual object. So that's the main idea here. And so he calls this digitalism, the belief that virtual objects, it's not that they don't exist, it's that they're special kinds of objects. And in particular, they are objects made up of bits. They are grounded. He'll later give us a definition where he describes them as being grounded in data structures or computational processes. We'll get there. For now, though, all right, well, actually, no, we're going to get there right now. Okay, so let's do this. What are virtual objects on Chalmers's view, and in particular, according to digitalism? So Chalmers defines virtual objects, according to digitalism, as being what he calls digital objects, which are constituted by computational processes, and specifically their data structures. And they are grounded. We saw this word last week. We said that grounding means dependent on. So digital objects are dependent on computational processes. And these computational processes are themselves dependent on physical processes. And these physical processes are enacted, or they run on physical computers. So we can break down digitalism according to the 4 different views, or the 4 different questions about objects, events, and experiences, and the values of them that we encountered a few slides back. So obviously, we've already seen that Chalmers thinks that virtual objects are digital objects, and because he's a realist, he thinks that they really exist. And what he would likely say is that they exist by virtue of being digital objects. The next thing Chalmers believes is that events in virtual worlds are largely digital events. He probably has to keep the largely because there may be some physical element. So for example, even though my having coffee with another avatar is largely digital, there is still the physical side of things in that I, in my physical being, am manipulating the virtual body, the virtual avatar. But the claim is that they are largely digital. And then the second part of that is that to the degree that they're digital, and as we sort of move into events that are more and more digital and less involve physical elements, that doesn't mean that they thereby become more and more fake. It doesn't mean that they become less real the more digital they become. Rather, it's that they take on a different kind of reality, digital reality. We then have experiences, and these are non-illusory. They're veridical. When I experience myself as walking into a building or having coffee with an avatar in Second Life, I am actually having a coffee, walking into a building. All that I'm doing is having a digital coffee or a virtual coffee. I'm walking into a digital building or a virtual building. But the point is, I am still walking into some kind of building. That is a real experience. It is veridical in the sense that there is something true about my perceptions of walking into a building and having coffee. And there's something true about my beliefs that if I form the belief that I'm having coffee, that's a true belief, according to this view. And then finally, we get the idea that virtual experiences can be as valuable as non-virtual experiences. And in particular, obviously, these are experiences of a digital world, according to Chalmers digitalism. Okay, so this is there are a number of ways one could be a virtual realist. This is the main one we're going to be interested in. So we're going to be, when we talk about the virtual realist, what we're talking about is digitalism, the digitalist. We're talking about Chalmers digitalism. So if we love these kind of flow diagrams because they help us to kind of divide up the logical space. They're also very useful for when you're studying. So hint for your exam, this will be useful for you. So we saw with free will, we did something similar to this. I forget what the question was I think it was the response that you could have to the philosophical problem of global determinism and free will. So here, we're not talking about responses to virtual reality. We're talking, I guess we are sort of, but basically what we're talking about are answers to the question, I guess you could say responses to the question of whether or not virtual reality is real. And there are two options here, sort of yes or no. On the yes side of things, you could be a realist. And like I've said, the realist view that we are considering is Chalmers's virtual digitalism. Oh, it shouldn't say libertarian there. See, that's the hangover from the free will side. So ignore the libertarian thing. It should just say virtual digitalism. Then on the no side of things, you could be an irrealist about virtual reality, which means that you liked the 4 different views or that package that we saw in the left-hand column on a few slides back. Now, we are going to look at 2 different ways that you could be an irrealist about virtual reality. They do overlap, so they're not completely distinct, but it's worthwhile to keep them separate because firstly, that's what Chalmers does, but also because the kind of lack of reality, or let me put it this way, how they explain the falsity of our beliefs. So when I form the belief there's a table, how these 2 different positions explain that falsity is a bit different. And so it's useful to just see how they explain why, say, when I'm in the matrix and I bump into a table, why the belief there is a table is false. So you could be a virtual fictionalist. So fictionalists in philosophy, it's actually like quite a big school. There are lots of fictionalists. But basically, what fictionalists do is they argue that the kind of beliefs that we form about a particular subject matter, say, they're not actually aiming at what they call literal truth. It's more truth as if, truth according to a fiction. So, for example, let's say I'm interested in truth in the context of Lord of the Rings, the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and I'm interested in the kind of truth, or let's say truth about stuff that Gandalf does, right? Gandalf the wizard. So, on the one hand, when I say Gandalf fought the Balrog, that's true in a sense because it's true in the context of the broader fiction of the novels, of the mythical world, of Middle Earth, of the Lord of the Rings trilogy as a whole. But it's not literally true. And the reason it's not literally true is because, unfortunately, sorry to break this to you if you didn't know this already, but Gandalf doesn't exist. The Balrog doesn't exist. And so if neither of them exists, they couldn't have fought. So that's the fictionalists. So fictionalists, I mean, actually quite a controversial but very interesting school of fictionalism is fictionalism in the philosophy of mathematics. So the idea there is that when I say 2 + 2 is 4, I'm not really talking about literal truth, like that's actually really literally true. What I mean is that it's true in the fiction of mathematics, and in particularly the fictions that numbers exist. The idea being that things need to exist in order for them to help make our beliefs about them true or false. And if numbers don't exist, then our mathematical beliefs can't be literally true. In fact, they're literally false. Like I said, controversial, but that's a fictionalist, and that's how fictionalism explains the falsity of our beliefs about virtual reality. They say, well, kind of in a sense it's true. Like if I'm in the Matrix and I bang into a table, in the sense my belief that's a table, it's true according to that fiction. In the fictional world of the Matrix, there is a table. But it's not literally true, because in real life, there is no table. So that's the fictionalist. And then you have virtual illusionism. So the illusionist doesn't really explain the falsity of our beliefs and perceptions about virtual reality in the same way as the fictionalist. Because the one way you can think about what the fictionalist is doing, it's almost like they're trying to allow a grain of truth. It's not literally true, but it's true according to a fiction, is what the fictionalist would say. So they talk about in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, they say it is true as if. So true as if the Matrix really existed, or in the context of Lord of the Rings, true as if Middle Earth existed, and Gandalf and the Balrog and so on. The illusionist doesn't do that. The illusionist just says, nope, it's non-veridical. It's just plain false. We are having an illusion. And to the degree that I put on virtual reality goggles, to the degree that, say, I exit the Matrix, but then I go back in, I am willingly taking on an illusion. I'm willingly putting myself in a position where I will be subject to illusions or hallucinations. Okay, so this is the kind of the different space of possibilities in terms of, is virtual reality real, yes or no, and the different positions you could take. We are going to focus on an argument for realism and the objections or the responses that the fictionalist and the illusionist have. So this I'm calling the causal argument from perception. That's in brackets because in the actual journal article, Chalmers keeps these arguments separate. He has the causal argument and there's the argument from perception. I didn't find those arguments very convincing in terms of how they were laid out. So this is just a flag that what I'm doing here is it's actually a rational reconstruction. This is not how Chalmers presented his argument, but I'm presenting it this way because I do think it will be slightly easier. And I think that it brings out the important points more, which is basically what he's trying to argue is that virtual objects, events, experiences, whatever, he's trying to argue that they're real. So that should be what our conclusions are. All right, so let's have a look at the first premise. So premise 1, when using virtual reality, I perceive virtual objects. So this, I've said there, the reason for this premise, or how I justify this premise, which is the part that's in the square brackets. The justification I've offered there is the definition of virtual reality. And in particular, what I'm thinking there is the fact that virtual reality is immersive. So if I'm immersed in it, I will be viewing things in that environment. And part of what I will be doing is perceiving virtual objects. My second premise is the causal basis of my perceptual experience is the objects that I perceive. Now, Chalmers has this premise in his original argument from perception. He justifies it with recourse to the philosophy of perception. So basically what he says is that it is a well-known claim or idea in the philosophy of perception that when I experience, say, a glass of water, the basis of this perception is a glass of water. And what I mean by basis, the glass of water causes my perception of the glass of water, and so on. Okay, so that's premise 2. Now, from premise 1 and 2, we can infer that virtual objects have causal powers. Because remember, in premise 1, I said I perceive virtual objects. What premise 2 tells me is that when I perceive something, the object I perceive is the basis of my perceptual experience. And so, what that seems to mean is that if I'm perceiving virtual objects, the virtual objects are the basis of my perception. They are the causal basis of my perception. In other words, if a virtual table is causing me to have a perception of a table, that virtual object can cause things. It has causal powers. So that's what we infer from premise 1 and 2. And then finally, we get our conclusion. Virtual objects are real digital objects. So how do we get here? How do we justify this conclusion? Well, we justify it based on premise 3, which is the idea that virtual objects have causal powers. And then an additional idea, which is quite a well-known and widely accepted one, which is that only things that exist have causal powers. So when I say that something caused another thing, it doesn't make sense for that thing to then not exist, because how could something that doesn't exist exert causal forces in the world? So then to kind of then step back, if something does exert causal powers in the world, the inference is that it must exist. It must be real. And so this is Chalmers's argument, or at least it's my rational reconstruction of his argument for the reality of virtual objects, based on the idea that they cause things, and in particular, they cause our perceptions of them. So there are 2 possible responses here. The problematic premise, I think most people think, is premise 2. Because remember, all you need to make this argument go through is premise 1 and 2, and then the idea that only things that exist can have causal powers, because premise 3 comes from premise 1 and 2. So just the mere existence of premise 1 and premise 2 already gives us premise 3. So if we want to try and diffuse this argument, we need to get rid of either premise 1 or premise 2. So premise 1 seems very uncontroversial. Like I said, it kind of follows from the definition of virtual reality. So that's a really hard premise to deny. Premise 2, on the other hand, we could deny that, because it seems that there are lots of examples of perceptions we have that aren't really caused by objects. So for example, when I'm dreaming and I dream that I interacted with a unicorn, does that mean that I actually, like, that a unicorn in the world caused that perception in my dream that I'm interacting with a unicorn? Most people would say no. So that's the fishy premise in this argument. And we're going to look at 2 different responses from each of the e-realist positions that we noted a few slides back. The first is the fictionalist response. And how the fictionalist tries to diffuse or dissolve this argument is by saying, no, the causal basis of my experiences in virtual reality is not virtual objects, but rather fictional representations of those objects. So a representation is a thing. But when, for example, if I'm reading Lord of the Rings and there's a representation of Gandalf, that representation doesn't represent anything. It's just it doesn't actually pick out Gandalf in the world. It's just a representation without a corresponding thing that is being represented. So what the fictionalist would then say is that representations can cause things, if you want to use that language. So for example, in the context of Lord of the Rings, Gandalf causes things to happen. But he doesn't really, right? Because again, what the fictionist would say is that insofar as those causes are causes in the story of Lord of the Rings, those are fictions. He's not really causing anything. Now, you might come back and say, well, actually, representations can cause things in the real world. So, you know, yes, on the one hand, Gandalf causes things in Lord of the Rings, right? He causes the Balrog to die, whatever. But the representation of Gandalf can also cause things to happen to me. Like when I think Gandalf has died, I get very sad. I may even cry. Who knows? Surely then we want to talk about the representation causing things in the real world as opposed to just in Lord of the Rings. And what the fictionalist would say is that's completely fine. A representation can cause things in the real world. But again, we need to distinguish between Gandalf causing things in the real world, Gandalf's death causing things in the real world, and a representation of Gandalf and or Gandalf's death causing things in the real world. And what the fictionists would say is that there isn't an actual object causing anything, it's a representation. And the representations that we encounter in the form of it when we go into virtual reality, those are false in the sense that there isn't actually anything being represented according to the fictionalist. It's just a myth. So that's the fictionalist response. I think it's a pretty good response. The one thing I would say though is that where the fictionalist where the idea that what's causing our perceptions is just a representation, I think that starts to fall apart a bit when we are dealing with virtual realities that involve elements that do seem to be real, basically. So by that I mean there's a difference between my being in a video game and say a Lord of the Rings video game and interacting with a representation of Gandalf versus my being in Second Life and interacting with other avatars and having coffee, going into buildings, whatever. Those representations, yes, on the one hand, they might represent elements that we are less inclined to say are real. So for example, representing me as going to a coffee shop when I'm not really in a coffee shop. But there are also elements of those representations that do seem real. Like if I'm actually talking to my friend or my friend's avatar, I might be inclined to say that I really did have a conversation with them. So the representation of the conversation is actually representing something that is real. It's representing the fact that we had a conversation. So the fictionalist response, I think, or this response to the causal argument, the idea that what's causing things is just representations, I think it works better for some virtual realities, but not for others. So it's not knocked down. Okay, so that's the fictionalist response. Let's have a look at the illusionist's response. So the illusionist, so this kind of relates back to the dream example I used, where if I have perceptions while I'm dreaming, we're not really inclined to say that those perceptions are actually caused by objects. And what the illusionist would say is that yes, like those kinds of experiences are widespread. And in particular, what we'd say is that they are illusions or hallucinations. So in my dream, there isn't actually a unicorn that I'm perceiving. I am hallucinating, basically, that there's a unicorn. And then on the flip side of it, in terms of virtual reality, there isn't actually a virtual object there that is causing my perception. It is, my perceptions are illusory. So I think this is actually a slightly weaker response compared to the fictionalist response. And the reason is because hallucinations are often quite fragmentary. They, some hallucinations are stably caused or reliably caused by particular objects taking particular substances or whatever the case is. But because they're illusions, they're not real. It's not the case that, for example, if I, for example, hallucinate a table in response to walking into a room, it's not every time I walk into that room that I will experience a table, right? So walking into the room doesn't reliably cause that hallucination. It might cause it once or twice, depending on a bunch of other variables. The issue for the illusionist is that our perceptions in virtual reality actually do appear to be reliably caused by particular things. And what they're reliably caused by are precisely the data structures and the computational processes that, for Chalmers, underlie his digitalism. So digital objects, digital events, and digital experiences. So he says, well, if my perceptions, let's say virtual objects, if my perceptions of virtual objects are reliably caused by these data structures, by these computational processes, then they start to look a lot less like illusions, like they're these kind of random perceptual anomalies or disturbances. What they start actually to look like is like I am perceiving something to do with that data structure or that computational process. I'm perceiving some aspect of it. And he would say, then it's a short step from saying I'm perceiving some aspect of that data structure to actually know I am perceiving the digital object that arises from that data structure. And if the data structure is real, so is the digital object. So that's the kind of, that's why I think the illusionist is less, it's a less convincing reply, in my view. But, okay, they do have a point, because remember, illusionism is about non-veridical perceptions of things. So when I perceive things to be a way that in reality there are not. And it seems that there are aspects of virtual reality that are just like that. Like, say that I'm in Second Life and I'm doing the thing of having a coffee with another avatar. And I am represented as being very close to this other avatar. Like, so we're across each other, say we're across a table. Now, and let's say that actually in real life, our avatars are thousands of miles apart. In the virtual world, we are represented as being close. In real life, we're actually not, we are far apart. So that property of being close, that does seem to be an illusion. It seems to be something that the virtual reality I'm represented as having, but I don't actually have. So that's the kind of lingering worry there, that actually there is just something straightforwardly illusory about virtual reality. And the way Chalmers puts it is that, well, virtual objects don't look like digital objects, right? Like when I'm interacting with my avatar friend and we're drinking virtual coffee, the virtual coffee doesn't look like a data object. It doesn't, a data structure. It doesn't look like a digital object. The avatar doesn't look like a digital object. It doesn't look like a data structure. It doesn't look like it's grounded in computational processes. But how Chalmers responds to this is by saying, okay, sure, but basically what he wants to say is that it's a little bit like when I look at a star and I go, okay, well, that star has the property of being twinkly and it has the property of only coming out at night. And he says, well, actually, technically speaking, that property isn't true of what stars really are. They are really enormous exploding balls of gas. He uses another analogy here, which is like water. He says, when we interact with water, it doesn't look like it has the property of being molecules of hydrogen and oxygen, right? There's nothing about this that makes it look like that. But in real life, that is how it looks. But that doesn't mean that we would thereby say that the property of water, that is wetness, that is whatever we want, transparency, whatever, we wouldn't say that water doesn't have those properties, right? What we would instead say is that in order to get at what water really is, we have to know about the underlying processes. So the same thing applies to my avatar. When I'm interacting or to the other avatars and my avatar in Second Life, when I'm interacting with them in the context of Second Life, what I just need to remember is that they kind of appear that way, but really they are grounded in data structures and particular processes. So you might think this is a satisfying answer. I am disinclined to think that it's satisfying. And the reason is because, like take the water example. There's a sense in which I can quote unquote zoom in on water. And what will be revealed is that it's molecules of hydrogen and oxygen. But then what I could do is I could say, okay, well, there's no deep incompatibility between water being wet and transparent and it actually being hydrogen and hydrogen and oxygen. The star example is similar. Yes, from far away, the star looks like it's twinkly and whatever. As I get close, I discover that those twinkles are actually exploding balls of gas, but there's nothing incompatible between the property of being twinkly far away and the property of close up being an exploding ball of gas. So virtual reality doesn't seem to be like that, because the property of being close to one another is incompatible with the property of being far apart. So if my avatar is close to another avatar in Second Life, but that avatar, the people who are manipulating the avatars, so myself and the other person, if we are actually far apart, then which property do we have? Are we close? Are we far? The point is that they're incompatible. So there's this lingering possibility of illusory perception. And Chalmers offers us this example of how we can think about it. So he takes, and this is actually I think it's a great example. It's a lot better than the close and far apart one. Let's take the property of redness. So a virtual flower that I encounter while I'm in the Matrix or in Second Life might be red. But it's obvious that the corresponding data structure isn't red, because data structures are computational processes, and computational processes aren't the kind of things that have colors. So on the one hand, the virtual flower, we know the virtual object isn't really red because the data structure isn't red. Moreover, the kind of red that the virtual flower is may not be a red that any flower in reality has, any non-virtual flower. So what that means is that to the extent that the virtual flower is red and has that particular kind of redness, then either it isn't real, it's because no existing object has that color, or the virtual object might be real, but the fact or the idea that it has the property is false. Because again, if we want to think about data structures don't have properties. So we can formulate this, we can actually formalize this as an argument. So it sort of reads like a really bad poem. Some virtual roses are red. Digital objects do not have colors. And we say that because, again, digital objects are data structures. So either the virtual rose is not a digital object because it doesn't exist, it's a fictional or it's an illusory object, or it exists, but it's not red. So either way, the property of redness is fake, because if the object doesn't exist, then it doesn't have that property. But we also have the case of, even if it does exist, it wouldn't have that property, because again, digital objects don't have colors. They don't have the properties that we experience them as having in virtual worlds. So this is kind of this is a way around for the virtual illusionist or the fictionalist. They can say, okay, sure, some virtual objects might be real objects, whatever that means, but it doesn't really matter, because the properties that we experience them as having, those aren't real. So when I bump into a table and I experience it as being hard or wood or whatever, those are not actual properties the table has. Those are fake. They're illusions or fictions. So Chalmers concedes that this argument would work. However, he has a comeback. He says, yes, digital objects don't have colors. That doesn't make any sense. But he also thinks that we need to distinguish between redness, as in non-virtual redness, redness in the real world, and what he calls virtual redness. So what he proposes to do is to change up the argument like this. Some virtual roses are virtually red, is what he says. Digital objects lack non-virtual colors. So data processes are not the kinds of things that have normal non-virtual colors. But here's the trick. They might have virtual colors. And all the Chalmers is saying in that first line is that some virtual objects, in particular virtual roses, have virtual colors. So the important part of this is that the conclusion no longer follows, because premise 1 and premise 2 are compatible with the virtual rose, firstly, existing, and secondly, it actually having a property of redness, but specifically the property of virtual redness. Premise 2 doesn't contradict that, because all that premise 2 says is it says that digital objects don't have non-virtual colors. It says nothing about whether or not they have virtual colors. So that's where we will end for today. But before we do, I want to flag what I think is a very big, glaring red flag alarm should be going off about this argument, which is, okay, the only reason the conclusion doesn't follow is because you distinguish between redness and virtual redness. And my question is, how on earth does that work? What is the difference between virtual redness and redness? And we can ask ourselves the question by looking at these two roses and going, okay, if there is a difference, which of these roses is virtually red and which is really red? So that's where we will end for today. Thank you so much for your time, and I will hopefully see you tomorrow in person. Again, watch this slowly, write down questions, take your time, and then we will review any questions you have about the content tomorrow.